something I meant to talk about last time. I was sitting here when talking about Family Day yesterday, the 14th, part of Songkran, was I'm often asked about family pressure, and this also is applicable to peer group pressure. Essentially, all those close to us throughout our lives, whether they be friends, family, social groups, work, associates, have an influence on our lives as we do them. And often when one comes to make changes in one's life, whether planned or unplanned, there can be some disruption in these friendships, relationships, associations. Sometimes positive, sometimes negative, or of course neutral. Very often younger people, especially I think living still at home, whom are looking at meditation and more specifically looking at Buddhist practice as a whole, have this concern that it is contrary to their family's beliefs, understanding, or their family or their peer groups' hopes and aspirations for themselves, ambitions. For example, a mother and father may strongly desire a student-aged member of the family to continue in education, gain qualifications, establish themselves in a career, have a family, children, and conform to the usual social structure. And this is quite understandable. And the question that arises is, I don't want to do this. I'm going to just be a Buddhist. I'm just going to meditate. Even I'm going to ordain, renounce, be a monk. This is as a result of enthusiasm for the practice, a keenness, an excitement, which I touched upon when it comes to talking about the Dharma. Excuse me. So what I wanted to try and explain is that this is nothing new, this is nothing unusual, and as well as reminding myself that of course the Buddha, when first sharing his insights, this discovery of his enlightenment with others, was firstly talking to his peer group, let's say, his ascetic companions, whom likewise disagreed with his idea, his view. They were very ascetic, and he was now eating ordinary food, albeit to an extent limited, and perhaps not practicing some of the austere practices they were. And then also he was going on to share the teachings of the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path with household people, householders, lay people, lay men, lay women. this is much the same as it is today. The survival of the fourfold Sangha has been as a result of its solid structure, like a table on 4 legs. There are monks, nuns or bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, lay men and lay women, or upasakas and upasakas. And this is the supportive structure to, let's call it the surface of the table, the sasana, the Buddha sasana, this Buddhist religion. Without one, you don't have the other. The lay people rely on the spiritual advice and assistance and teachings of the monastics, the Sangha, the Ordained Sangha, and the Ordained Sangha, the monks, the nuns, rely on the lay people for their support for material needs, requisites, robes, shelter, food and medicine. So this isn't new, not new at all. You discover the Buddha's teachings and you really want to dive in deep, dive into the deep end, start meditating and do nothing else. And that's good news. It's good that you appreciate the possibility to reduce suffering, if not become even free from suffering in this lifetime through this practice of sila, keeping moral virtue, meditation, and developing wisdom. So what we need to remember is that it is just that. The Buddha taught this Noble Eightfold Path both to lay people and to monastics. This Noble Eightfold Path can be used just as effectively by lay people as it can by monastics whom seemingly are fully immersed in the practice. Now, I say seemingly because let's take this as an example. You are a student or you are embarking on a career and you have either close associations with your family or peer group that you associate with, and you are embarking also on the Buddhist practice. You are endeavouring to follow sila or practice sila, samadhi, panya by following this Noble Eightfold Path. And you feel that they are not supportive of what you are trying to do. Understandably, you may not have had the opportunity to even explain to them. It's taken you some time, if not a very long time, to understand it yourself. And gain enough knowledge, sufficient confidence in the Buddha's teachings to make some changes, large or small, major or minor, to your life to that end, to practicing sila, samadhi, panya. And this is the practice, this is correct. However, if you feel you're unsupported by your family and your peer group, that is normal. That is okay. It doesn't need to hold you back. And you don't need to have any less respect for their beliefs, their lifestyle, than you ever have. Nothing has changed. You will change only for the better. And your family, your friends, they will see a change in you that is for the better, and one day will say, hey, you've changed. What have you done? What's happened? What's happened to the old person that used to be a little bit grumpy, a little bit moody, a little less tolerant than you are now, and a little less kind? We do not run away from responsibility to find, to follow, to practice this path. We do not try and run away from our problems and the suffering we are experiencing in samsara, in household life, to, say, the monastic life or to the practice alone, in order to become free from suffering. No. We face up to the suffering in samsara. We face up and we are loyal to our responsibilities. We do what has to be done whilst we're lay people. If anyone thinks you can run away to the forest, become a monk, and all of your troubles will disappear, then that is wrong view. But not only that, it is just plain misunderstanding of what actually happens and how one goes about renunciation, both in a practical and also considerate way, to not leave people behind hurt and disappointed in you. And likewise, being kind to yourself, you cannot take yourself from what you're used to and put yourself into something completely different and expect to be free from all of your concerns. All you need to do is follow the Noble Eightfold Path, developing right view, having right intention, right speech, action. Your livelihood, so this is where your peer group comes in to play, whatever job you're doing. Hopefully you're not having to work in an abattoir or in a munitions factory or a brewery, because of course they would not be considered as coming under right livelihood. But even if you are, continue with the work you are obliged to do until you can find a suitable replacement for that job. Look around, find something else. If you can do that job, you can do another. If those people employ you, other people will employ you also. Don't walk out, oh, this is against the practice. The Buddha never suggested that. You're aware, you know it's not right livelihood. This is one step on the Noble Eightfold Path. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood. And you put all the effort you can, as well as into your other duties, into keeping your moral virtue. So this comes under right view and under right intention, right speech and right action. All of your actions of body, speech and mind. And action is translated into karma. Usually I'm translating Pali word into English, but when you think of good karma, it gives you a good feeling. So by acts of body, speech and mind, wholesome acts, I should say, of body, speech and mind, not only are you developing wholesome mind states and reducing unwholesome mind states, and that in turn will result in those wholesome acts of body, speech and mind, you are keeping sila, which is part of the Noble Eightfold Path, the majority of the Noble Eightfold Path, and you are not offending anyone. You are behaving responsibly. And you have also this effort applied to the practice of mindfulness, sati, and concentration, samadhi, meditation. If you are keeping moral virtue, practicing meditation, and developing your wisdom, both through those to former and also through understanding the teachings of the Buddha, you are establishing in yourself right view. And this can be done just as well outside of the monastery as inside of the monastery, just as well as a lay person or as a renunciant, as an upasaka, upasika, or a bhikkhu or a bhikkhuni. And you have to start somewhere. I had to start somewhere. The majority of my practice, the hard work, the foundations in my case, which is actually quite similar to most people, especially coming from non-Buddhist countries, was done in lay life, whilst I still had family responsibilities, whilst I still had a job or work to do, be done, whilst I still had a house or accommodation to maintain and pay for. And without affecting any of that, right effort was applied to find the time to practice some meditation and to develop wholesome mind states and reduce unwholesome mind states, and also be mindful, careful, and ever vigilant and protective of my newly found, as it was for me, moral virtues of no killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, or taking of intoxicants. Now, to me, that sounds quite ludicrous that I had any issues with trying to keep any of those 5 precepts now. But back in the early days of my practice, I was probably breaking all 5 of those precepts. And sometimes in not an overly immoral way, and not necessarily with bad intention, but purely through some lack of understanding and ignorance. I'm talking about myself, but this applies to many, many people coming to this practice, coming to Buddhism. If you go in all guns blazing, stand up at the dinner table and say, "Hey, Mum and Dad, I've become a Buddhist. I don't agree with this and that, and I'm going to do things this way in the future," you're not being kind. You're not being kind to your mother and father, your parents, who've put so much of their life, commitment, love, to determination and energy and effort into your upbringing, and you're not being kind to yourself, because this will not aid you in your practice. The challenge, and the Buddha did not say this was an easy path to enlightenment. It is a challenge. It is a difficult path. You are swimming against the stream. By that I mean you are going against all that samsara being worldly life, is encouraging you to do. It is encouraging you to be materialistic. It is encouraging you to break many of those precepts. It is encouraging you to be goal-orientated and create this personality, this self. All of the things that this practice is trying to really reduce in order to bring about contentment, resulting in happiness. But you start slowly and steadily, building on foundations of moral virtue, sila, developing your skills in meditation, the ability to focus your mind on one meditation object, developing samadhi. This will enable you, through meditation, to see clearly, which is vipassana. Samadhi meditation, vipassana meditation are just results of meditation. One thing, meditation. The Noble Eightfold Path says mindfulness and samadhi. Samadhi means meditation. Mindfulness means really being very careful, aware, consciously aware of all that is you are, all of your actions through body, speech and mind throughout your activities. if, for instance, you go and live in a monastery, you're going to be no more free to practice than at home. You don't just become a monk in this Buddhist tradition, in the Theravada tradition I'm specifically referring to, but I think in others also. You have many years. Firstly, you go and stay and you live in a monastery as a layperson. You take the 8 precepts. So no sexual activity whatsoever, no beautification or adornments, no eating after midday, and there's no entertainment. And you sleep in a simple bed or on the floor. So that's where those 5 precepts change and increase to 8. And then the next step, after quite some time, you may become an anagarika, which means you officially wear some white robes and you are not able to ever really leave the monastery or use money. And this you could stay as for maybe 1 year or 2 years. And only then would you, and this is in non-Buddhist countries, in this tradition in Western countries. But also for people from non-Buddhist countries, let's call them Westerners for want of a better term, coming to Buddhist countries, like myself coming to Thailand. We have to still have this training of anagarika, which is white-robed, kapya first, which is general dog's body in the monastery, doing all of the jobs, cleaning the toilets, washing up, cleaning the floors, cleaning up after the random dogs that live in the monastery, feeding the random dogs that live in the monastery. All of the jobs you wouldn't necessarily even want to do at home for your dear mum and dad. You'd argue about it. But you have to do them gratefully for giving the opportunity for service. And then you have all of the study and the learning. Very little time to find time to meditate and practice. My biggest struggle and argument with the whole staying in the monastery at this stage of events was that I had no time to meditate, and when I was even having a full-time job I had more time to meditate than this, I used to say. But of course you should be mindful all of the time. This is meditation all of the time. Mindful of the fact how much you really hate cleaning the toilets when it's 45 degrees and every creature under the sun is biting you and frogs are jumping out of the toilets at you. This kind of thing. It's hard. And then even after this time you become a samanera, a novice novice monk or nun. I'm not quite sure how it works in the female side, I'm sorry about that, but it's the same, I'm sure. And you have then at least another year, maybe 2, as a samanera. And then when you take higher ordination, you become a bhikkhu. Even then there's another 5 years of you stay in the monastery. I'm at this stage now, I'm a navaka bhikkhu, which is a newly ordained bhikkhu. I'm in my 3rd year, so I've still time to go. I've been out and about, but under the close watch of my upacharya, my supervisor, my teacher, my senior monk, whom looks after me at my main monastery where I ordained. And now I have moved country, I've moved monastery. And here it's much stricter. I don't go out at all. I stay here within this monastery, very happily, I might add. But it is still a gradual process. That is far stricter than you're ever going to be facing either within your peer group or with your family at home. And you have many more duties in the monastery, in the monastic sangha. You have morning puja, evening puja. You have to go on alms round at a specific time. You cannot think for yourself. Everything is done for you, which is nice. But you are in a very, very closely monitored, strict environment. So when you're concerned about mum and dad not supporting you, remember, they really are. Your mother and father are your greatest blessing, to whom you are most grateful for giving you this opportunity in this lifetime to be human. And even if you're not with the mother and father that biologically created you, someone has looked after you. And it's a very small way of paying them back to go along within Sila with their ideas of what you should be doing with your life. And also, for your own benefit, it gives you something to fall back on. You build a career, you build some success. You don't have to get married, you don't have to get into a family situation. If that is part of your culture, then this you need to discuss sensitively with them and their religious leaders. If you're not wanting to get married and you're feeling that you may be under a little pressure to do so, that's a whole different conversation and a different subject, really. But generally speaking, with regards to family life, as I experienced, and peer group and work life, moving into monastic life, it's a slow but progressive transition. And we also are building up patient endurance. I lose track of the time, even what day of the week it is, to be honest with you, because I'm fully immersed in my practice. And I'll tell you a story about this and how this combines with lay life in just a moment. You build up patient endurance with this slow progression towards what you think you want to do. And you may well one day ordain and become a monk, or just be able to practice more deeply as a layperson. And you don't even then need to really trouble your family with what you're doing, as long as they know you're okay. If you drop all your responsibilities before you've established your practice, then you're also being disrespectful to them and yourself. Because if your practice doesn't go according to how you think it might, then you've got nothing to fall back on. The greatest opportunity we have is to be practicing this path, this Noble Eightfold Path, in lay life at first, where you are exposed to a little bit more distraction and suffering, and you can really see the reactions of the mind. It is only when we've got used to practicing mindfulness in that environment that we can have the strength of sati, the strength of mindfulness, to use it in a very much more conducive atmosphere, environment to establishing samadhi meditation. Because if you are straight into, say, a meditation retreat, which is usually just for a short time, you'll find it takes quite a bit of time to calm down, cool down, and by the time you get into your samadhi, it's time to leave. When you're coming into the life of samadhi and meditation, you need an even longer time to bring your mindfulness into a stage whereby it will work towards increasing your ability to practice samadhi. And it does take a while. So I would say 15 years ago, when I first started practicing meditation, maybe not quite that long, between 10 and 15 years. I haven't got any dates in front of me or nothing written down, so I'm not sure. I was working and using opportunities at work to take short meditation breaks, practicing mindfulness, listening to Dharma on podcasts and things like that, and slowly developing my knowledge of the path. If I'd spoken to my parents about it at that stage, and my family, they wouldn't have really been that interested. No, I wasn't doing anything contrary to their own beliefs or way of life, but I had made various changes in my life anyway. So it was kind of a little way hidden by those changes. But nevertheless, if you're much younger and you're still very much closely in the family group, then people will notice your behavioural patterns being slightly different. If you're not going to the cinema so often, or you're not going out with your friends clubbing, you can still be doing some of these things. You may give up drinking alcohol, and this is quite important to the path, so they may notice this, depending on the culture you're from. But no one's going to criticize you, no one's going to complain about you keeping these precepts. They're very, very bland. They're quite specific, but they fit in with any other religion's precepts or commandments or rules. So they're not going to be an issue really with anybody. And anyone putting pressure on you to break any of those 5 precepts is really not worth spending much time with for your own protection, kindness and safety. The good news is you can still further your practice as a lay person, and one day you may decide to take it further and spend more time in the monastery. And as happened with me, I started spending more and more time in the monastery, and then going abroad to spend time in the monastery. I'm not going to talk so much about travelling now, because I want to leave that for a separate talk, possibly tomorrow, because these two things are linked. They go a little bit together when you are living in a country which isn't necessarily a Buddhist country, or a country where there isn't much access to the Dharma, to the Sangha, or to be able to practice. In my case, there was some travelling involved, but as far as my peer group, my family, my work colleagues, I was still working at first, were concerned, I was holidaying. This is normal. I didn't say as much, but they assume. And they say, "Where did you go?" "I went and stayed in a monastery for 2 weeks." "Really? How was that?" "It was great." "Oh, good for you," they'd say. You know, I didn't then say, "Oh, you should do this, you should do that, you shouldn't stand on ants, and you shouldn't drink that beer." No, let them stand on ants and drink their beer. They don't know better. Have compassion. It's what you do that matters. Now, as we progress, we develop a little bit of disenchantment with the world, with worldly life, with samsara, with household life. But this doesn't mean we develop any disrespect for that. We still have respect for it. I, for instance, really got unused to keeping up to date with the news. Having come from an industry where I had to be so much on the ball with the news, the day-to-day news, I kind of just ditched that straight away. I included it within entertainment, and I'd been living on the 8 precepts for some time. In fact, I think it's okay to listen to some news occasionally. It isn't considered entertainment, but I still don't listen to the news. And on one occasion I returned in January to England from having spent some time in a Thai monastery here, and I still had my little flat, which was near my mother's house in her village, and it had nothing in it. I'd given everything away because I was thinking of ordaining at this stage, but I'd kept it because they would have been worried if I'd got rid of it. And I paid rent, but my first night there, having returned quite late in the evening, woke up early in the morning as usual, monastic time zone difference, a bit confused. It was frosty outside, and of course I wasn't used to frost and ice. Stepped out of my first, second, or even possibly third floor, I don't know, flat, stepped onto these metal staircase and slid down the stairs, grabbing behind me with my right arm the banister post. I ripped my shoulder out of the socket, dislocating my shoulder, which was seriously the most agonizing pain I've ever experienced or ever. I sincerely hope there is no greater pain than that. I've been told by females it is even worse, who have dislocated their shoulders, that pain is even worse than childbirth. So anyone who has dislocated their shoulder knows exactly what I mean. It was terrible. And went sliding down the stairs, bashed myself up a little bit, but recovered sufficiently, having no mobile at this time because I'd just returned to the country, Sims and this and that. Thought, well, I have to make my way to my mother's. So crawled along the pavement, freezing cold, having come from 40 degrees or 35, 6 degrees temperature at that time of year to now what was probably minus something. Banged on my mother's door as best I could and woke her up. What are you doing? I said, please can you call an ambulance? No, don't be so silly, you don't need an ambulance. I said, I really do. And she said, no. And after some toing and froing, she said, oh, get ready, I'll take you to hospital. I said, really, please, call an ambulance. I knew the ambulance would have some kind of pain relief, that an aspirin, a paracetamol was not going to achieve, like gas and air, something like this, you know, and having had accidents before. Eventually, some persuasion time later, my mother did concede, called an ambulance, and of course what do they do when they see me? I'm in my white weird gear, a bit tanned I suppose, having come from Thailand, but shaved head at this stage, and they looked at me and did the usual tests that they do. What's your name? Dan, I got that okay. Anagarika Dan. I was thinking Pakao, this is what they call the white-robed kapias or assistants in the monasteries here, or Pakao. But I knew my name. And what year is it? Oh, now that did throw me. Not that I hadn't really, it was January, we had New Year, but we hadn't had New Year celebrations where I had been. And in Thailand, the year is 2566 now, as you may or may not know. So their tax disc things in their car say 2567 when they will expire. It is that year here. They do change the year now in January, but it's still 2566 years after the Buddha, as opposed to our 2023 years after Jesus. So AD or CE, Christian era, and BE, Buddhist era, 2566. Back then, I think it was 2550 something. They said, what year is it? And because I'd been learning this, it was in my head. I said 2558 or 6 or something. And they looked at me. And who's the Prime Minister? I've no idea. Because of course I hadn't had any idea. I'll let you into a little secret. I have no idea now who the Prime Minister is. And that's no word of a lie. Of my country, that is. Or this. I know the Indian Prime Minister because you can't get away from it when you're living there, Mr. Modi, but other than that, no idea. So this was it. You know, I'd condemned my fate. I was going in this ambulance to hospital whether I needed to or not, because of course I'd taken a serious bash to my head and didn't know what day of the week it was, let alone the Prime Minister or the year. Well, of course, what they didn't know, I didn't know this stuff anyway, even without bashing my head. And my mother's saying, no, it's because he's kind of like a monk. He doesn't know these things. There's nothing wrong with him. And I'm just thinking, I'm in such pain, just give me some gas and air. So I wasn't developing as much resilience to pain. And I think even now, if I dislocated my shoulder, I would require gas and air. It is very painful. It's hurting now just thinking about it, talking about it. Anyway, they took me to hospital, and on the way we had this talk about where I'd been, what I'd been doing, and all became clear. But the reason I share that story is because I had gone away, I'd slowly reduced all of the things I thought were unnecessary in my life. I had an empty flat, no furniture, no bed, no TV. I'd given it all away, but I still kept the flat. I reduced my working hours to the bare minimum I could do to pay the rent, but I still went to work. I still dressed appropriately for my work, and I still did my job, my work diligently and professionally. I still kept in touch and in contact socially with my family, and went to our regular weekly get-togethers that we used to have back in those days on a Thursday evening, and or when they were expecting me back from one of my trips, when they'd also get together and I would appear at some point in the evening. They would be hoping and praying. And on one occasion, when they hadn't heard from me from over a month because I'd dropped my phone in the sea and I'd been living on an island in Cambodia, so no access to communication, I was welcomed by a whole crying family who had assumed the worst and that I'd gone off to some island in Cambodia and died. And they were surprised to see me, but pleasantly surprised and pleased that I hadn't died, despite the fact that I usually did turn up when I said I was going to turn up. But I tried not to trouble them with all of these things, or even talk about it much unless they asked. Now, this not only helped them get used to how I was changing, it helped me in compartmentalizing a little bit my practice as something that was exclusive to my own personal development and not reliant on other people. Because we are responsible for ourselves. We are responsible for our own karma, our actions of body, speech and mind, and the results. We are the owners of the results of that karma, our actions of body, speech and mind. And this goes on from lifetime to lifetime. Likewise, in this present moment, in this life as we are now, in our families, in our groups, our work associates, our colleagues, our friends, our social groups, we are responsible for those relationships and being kind. So we maintain these responsibilities. It is part of the path. So hopefully this gives you some encouragement to many inquiries I get about this very issue of, oh, my family don't agree with what I'm doing. Well, I'd suggest you've probably been a little enthusiastic about what you're doing. Not in your own mind, you can never be too enthusiastic, but in how you may have portrayed it to others. I might have suggested in the previous video a couple of times back, keep it your secret. Not so much a secret, but share, but don't overshare. And always remember, it's a simple practice, Sila, Samadhi, Panya. And the Four Noble Truths is as applicable to any person in any religion, any human being, other beings also, as is the Noble Eightfold Path. There's no controversy about it. It isn't a cult. It isn't an obscure teaching. It is common sense. It's not even a philosophy. It is a way of life. It is a practice, the practice of Sila, Samadhi, Panya. And this, I hope, will make you realize that you still have full potential to ordain, to become a monk, to become a nun, or even to attain to enlightenment without doing that in lay life. Very many more people in lay life have become arahants, fully enlightened, than in monastic life, mainly because there are a huge number more lay people than monastic people, of course. But percentage-wise, of course, the higher percentage of arahants to monastics than arahants to lay people. Because the monastic life is conducive towards the path, and that path is what we follow towards, happily, towards Nibbana. I say happily because this should be a joyous practice, practiced happily. And it should result in your family, your associates, your peer groups, your colleagues, your social groups, seeing a positive change in you, nothing negative, and them in turn sharing mudita, altruistic joy, sympathetic joy, pleasure in your happiness. And you're giving them the gift of doing no harm to yourself, to them, by keeping sila. And you are also learning to develop your own compassion towards those whom don't understand your practice. So in the next video I'll talk about travel and seekers, because the person whom most recently reminded me of this subject was also asking about that and the travels they have done in this seeking. And my initial response was to that, to stop seeking and see, because it is about that, just that, seeing clearly. For as much as we seek, we will not see unless we open our minds to all that's in front of us, leaving what's behind us in the past and what's ahead of us in the future, and dealing effectively with what we have in front of us here and now. It's getting dark, that means I've spoken for a little bit too long once again. And if it's useful, please use it. And if it's not, don't. Thank you for watching.